This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. I feel very fortunate today to welcome Dr. Ieva Jusionyte, who is a legal and medical anthropologist and associate professor at Brown University. Ieva is also a trained EMT, paramedic, and wildland firefighter, and has spent 5 years volunteering in fire and rescue departments in Massachusetts, Florida, and Arizona. She is the author of the award-winning ethnography Threshold: Emergency Responders on the U.S.-Mexico Border, and most recently, Exit Wounds: How U.S. Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border, which was published with University of California Press just a couple of months ago in 2024. A recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a National Science Foundation Award, and a Harvard Radcliffe Fellowship, she has been studying borders, violence, and security in Latin America and the United States for over 15 years. In addition to her acclaimed scholarly work, Ieva's popular writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Los Angeles Times, The Boston Globe, The Guardian, and many, many more outlets. So her book is getting lots and lots of coverage, and I'm so excited that she is here to join us today. So Ieva, Exit Wounds is your second book, and it's a book that really establishes you, I think, as a crucial voice in gun scholarship within the social sciences. So can you tell us the story of how you made this pivot to studying gun violence?
First of all, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be on your show, Jenny. So thank you for having me. Exit Wounds is actually my third book. My first book was a dissertation-based work in South America that's not really connected to what I'm doing right now. But for my second book, Threshold, I was working as an emergency responder on the border in southern Arizona and in northern Mexico. And I was meeting a lot of people who were fleeing violence, trying to get into the United States, either across the border without asking for permission or asking for asylum. If you walk or if you drive into Mexico, you see these signs that warn you that guns and ammunition are prohibited in Mexico. So at first I didn't pay them very much attention, but then, I don't know, several months after I began my field work, I started asking questions. Why are these signs there? What are gun laws in Mexico? What is the situation? And then I connected the dots. I understood that the people I'm seeing who are risking their lives and who are getting injured trying to get into the United States, they are running away from violence that is mostly caused by guns from the United States. So that's how I decided to do this project and to follow the guns south from Arizona and Texas and other parts of the country to wherever they go, primarily in Mexico.
And I'm curious if you got any advice or warnings as you moved into gun studies. I'm curious when you made this pivot, if you got any reactions from colleagues.
I don't think that happened. I think people were mostly incredulous because in anthropology, studying guns maybe is even less common than in other social science fields. Some of my colleagues were already quite surprised when I became an emergency responder. So studying something that's unexpected for others was not maybe so surprising for them. And when I told them I would be moving into guns, I think the main question they had is it feasible in terms of doing ethnography, and is it going to be dangerous to studying trafficking? I don't think they had so many questions about guns themselves as the object of study.
Yeah, I really want to get into that. But before we do, I am actually curious, because you've been giving so many talks and you've gotten so much media coverage for this book, I'm curious what's been the most surprising reactions you've gotten so far with this first wave of media interest.
I am maybe forgetting right now because there was a period of time where, there is this song that was playing on the radio recently that I can do with my eyes closed. And I think a lot of answers I began to give were almost automatic. I don't think anything surprised me in terms of the questions. A lot of them are very predictable. That's why I particularly like I talked for the New Books Network with a fellow ethnographer, anthropologist, Regan Gillam, and now I'm so excited to talk to you because I think scholars ask different kinds of questions, especially on the media when you have 1 minute to summarize the big takeaway of this research project that took so many years.
So I do want to start actually by talking about some of the misconceptions that people bring into this conversation. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for your book and your scholarship because it is such a rich engagement that really addresses, again, so many of those misconceptions. And, one of the first, and this is something that I've even experienced on panels where people, and these are like panels of scholars, not people, journalists who are just covering this as part of their beat or whatever, where they'll say things like, let's talk about all the guns coming into the U.S. from Mexico. And you're like, what? What? That is not the direction. And so, I think this focus that you're putting on the pipeline from U.S. to Mexico with respect to guns, that's something that even just thinking through the scale of it, thinking through the, how that flow actually happens is a huge, huge piece of the conversation that we don't have. So can we actually just start by mapping out the scale of this iron pipeline flowing into Mexico from the U.S.?
Numbers are not a friend of an ethnographer, but I think they kind of help you to understand the scale of things. According to various estimates, maybe 200,000, maybe 500,000 weapons cross the border from the United States to Mexico every year. From what is recovered in crime scenes in Mexico, which then is being submitted for tracing, Mexican law enforcement asks for help from ATF. About 70%, that's 70, are traced to sources in the United States. Usually they trace about 20,000 guns per year, so not 100 or not 200,000, but that's totally understandable because they only find a little fraction of the guns that are circulating in the country. Then the other big difference between Mexico and the United States is that Mexico has 2 gun stores. They had only one when I began research. Since 2019, they now have 2. In the United States, you probably know this better, but if you look only at border states and you look at federally licensed gun dealerships that have a storefront, so either gun shops or pawnbrokers, there are about 10,000 of them. It's very clear the direction in which the guns are going, and that is they are going south.
Yeah, and that was actually another point of misconception that I was going to talk about, which I think you tweeted about this recently, that, journalists love to talk about, the one gun store in Mexico, which I have definitely fallen to that, that misconception myself. And that's not true. So there's 2 gun stores. And I actually think the way that you weave the establishment of this second gun store into your book is just so illuminating of the dynamics that you're trying to unravel. So can you tell us the sort of backdrop of how Mexico came to get its second gun store?
It's not only the journalists, even the Mexican government in the lawsuit says that there was only one gun store, and that's an error. But they are not wrong in the sense that Mexico only has one entity that is importing all the guns and that is selling all the guns, and that is Secretariat of National Defense, so the Mexican military. They operate both of these stores. Since the 1970s, they only had one store on the military base in Mexico City, where people from all over the country had to go apply for a license, and then that was the only place they could buy guns from a very limited kind of catalog and limited calibers that they were allowed to buy. But then a lot of gun owners who like hunting, for example, they live in northeastern Mexico, so on the other side of Texas. It's in Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, that area of the country. So it was very far for them to go to Mexico City, and a lot of them began buying guns in the United States illegally, just because of proximity, also because of wider variety of guns they could buy for hunting or for collecting or for self-defense. So the second store was opened in 2019, and there were kind of questions whether gun owners were in favor of it, because they have to register their firearms once they buy them with the government, and they thought it would be more difficult for them to register guns that were not sold in the store if there was one store in their region.
So that's super fascinating to hear about concerns of the government with respect to gun registration, because when we think about sort of resistance to gun registration, we often think about the U.S. context. We think about U.S. gun politics. And so it's super fascinating to hear that kind of concern being articulated in the context of Mexico. And I have to say that reading through your book, which was so rich with so many, we're going to talk about a bunch of the people that you profile, but Miguel in particular and his fellow shooting enthusiasts, I thought it was fascinating how you really not only brought us into their world, but really showed how their embrace of guns was this response to state failure and escalating fears surrounding gun violence. And of course, this sounds all too familiar. Totally reminds me of my field work in Metro Detroit and the embrace of concealed carry there. I think it's fascinating to think about how your work challenges what, I think a lot of Americans and a lot of people across the globe think of as a very uniquely American culture surrounding guns and the place of guns as, not just instruments of violence, but also tools of safety, protection, self-defense. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us about, how you wrestled with that and how your fieldwork challenges this typical treatment of American gun politics, gun violence, and gun ownership as uniquely American.
It's actually quite interesting because when I began this project and I began looking at firearms, I hadn't studied U.S. gun culture. So, one of the first books I read was your first book about gun owners. And I had no idea whether Mexico has a gun culture, but I didn't know much about gun culture in the United States as well. So I started this very kind of open-minded. And obviously the first people who wanted to talk to me were gun owners who were proud of what they are doing. So a lot of them were gun collectors, or they were hunters, or were recreational shooters. Some of them grew up going on hunting trips around Mexico, but also going to the United States, to Texas to hunt. So in a way, and they were reading Safari International and other kinds of hunting magazines. So there is this international, I think, kind of culture of hunters. Then there is a disconnect between they don't have a Second Amendment. They don't think about their gun rights as something that is part of their culture and part of their rights as citizens necessarily. So that was kind of different. And I think Miguel is a really good character in this way, because I talked to a lot of gun owners and some of them were kind of more only inclined to think about guns for hunting, and others are more interested in guns for security. But he was interested in both of these things. He was concerned with the lack of state-offered protection for Mexican citizens, as well as he was interested in collecting old guns and taking them to the range and taking them to hunt deer or pigeons or other animals.
Yeah, this question of how guns relate to citizenship and national identity is a really fascinating one. And you start the book by actually giving us this really fascinating and rich overview of the Mexican firearms industry and how invading and colonizing forces shaped not just the availability of guns in the country, but also what those guns meant politically. And so one of the things that I think is really amazing, and it's subtle, but you do it throughout the book, is actually help your audience read guns. So you take care to note whether guns are Mexican made or not. You bring us into the slang that people use for different kinds of guns, like goat horns for AKs. What is the Spanish word again for that?
Cuerno.
Okay, yeah. So you just kind of blend this in. And then, of course, how guns connect to broader imaginaries, which I know you don't use that word imaginary in your book, but I'm going to use it in this interview, of cartel violence and state force and individual defense. And so can you explain to us why this context is so necessary for understanding contemporary Mexican gun culture and gun violence?
Oh, I did use the term imaginaries.
Oh, you did?
The first draft.
Oh, yeah. But then you write about in one of the appendices, right? You're like,
yes.
I deleted that word, and I was like, oh, that was probably a good decision.
I was told to delete it. Yes.
But that's sad because I love that word. But yes.
Yes, because I think a lot of this is about imagination, how we imagine the relationship between a citizen and the state or broader society. So in the United States, we have this individualism, individual right to own guns and individual sovereignty against the state. And in Mexico, I kind of wanted to ask these questions. So what role do guns play in their culture? But looking through history, so what role did guns play historically? And historically, most guns in Mexico, well, they didn't have their own firearms manufacturing industry. Yes, there was Mendoza and there were some other companies that made guns, but there was no gun lobby, and that industry was kind of very, very, very limited. So most of the weapons for various wars that Mexico engaged in, like to defend against intervention from the United States or from France, they were fighting with foreign weapons, European weapons and American weapons. And when they passed their constitution in 1917 during the revolution, the guns were kind of part of what citizens could own, but they were more concerned about guns as a national sovereignty issue. They wanted to create their own gun industry so they would not depend on guns from foreigners who could regulate, like United States could impose a gun embargo depending on who was in the government in Mexico. If they didn't want, they could decide whether they send the guns to the rebels during the revolution or the government and things like that. So Mexican new leaders of Mexico after the revolution, they were thinking, well, we need to kind of have our own guns so foreign powers cannot decide our internal affairs based on that. And since then, well, guns are, if you go to Mexico City and you see these murals from Diego Rivera or Juan Orozco and other muralists, you see guns are an important part of that culture of Mexican independence and Mexican nationalism. But then it never trickles down to an individual gun owner. It is more like part of collective national identity, which never materialized really, because Mexico only very recently began producing their own firearms for the military, which was maybe in like mid-2000s. So I think that's a very interesting comparison between this individualist and more like nationalist or collective relationship to guns, and imaginary maybe.
Yeah, well, and it's so fascinating because, there's a lot of scholarship on U.S. gun culture that argues that, part of the appeal of the militia movement or just owning whatever kind of firearm is a way to sort of participate in that broader sort of, and it is collective. I mean, it's individual, but it's also collective, that sort of historical imaginary of what guns have served in the various aspects of the, American political project. And so what you're saying is actually Miguel is definitely into hunting. He's into self-defense, but he's not thinking about this as a way to tap into Mexican identity and that sort of thing in the way that Americans would.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Super fascinating. So I want to actually get into more of the stories that you tell. And, this book is amazing. I think if you haven't read it yet and you're listening, you should buy it. You will not be able to put it down. You should definitely make sure you have time set aside when you open it up for the first time, because it's one of those rare, quote unquote, I don't even want to call it an academic book because it's so engaging and so engrossing. And part of that is that we just have these stories unfold, the way you weave in from ATF agents in the U.S., Mexican gun enthusiasts, you have a former member of the Zetas, nonprofit leaders, journalists. I mean, you really do such an incredible job. And so I want to start actually with perhaps what is the most striking figure in this study, which is Samara. Could you tell us who she is, and also how did you connect with her? How did you meet her? How did you get her willing to tell you her story?
So Samara is, when I met her, she was already in her early 20s, but the story that I recount in the book, because I got to know her very well and she shared that story with me. Her parents migrated to the United States, to Texas, when she was young. She grew up with her grandparents and aunts, and when she was a teenager, I think she was 13, she was abducted and forcefully recruited to be a member of the Zetas, which is one of the most powerful organized crime groups in Mexico, in Northeast Mexico. So she went to a training camp and she became a leader of a small cell. And then she got injured during a fight and she goes to a juvenile prison. And she has a long and interesting and complicated story. I got to know her because as an ethnographer, I was very open to talking to everyone and anyone who wanted to talk about guns in Mexico. And at some point, I began talking to social workers who were visiting these neighborhoods, working with at-risk youth. A lot of them were imprisoned in Mexico for various firearms violations, because if you are found by the military or the police with a gun, and most people do not have licenses to carry guns, or if you have a bigger weapon like a cuerno de chivo, like an AK-47, the government can immediately charge you with possession of firearms designated for military use, and you are in prison. There's no need to even investigate the crimes or your association with organized crime or like what else you've committed. If you were found with a gun, you go to prison. So a lot of the social workers that work, they knew a lot of these people, and I began talking to them, and I was particularly surprised that there were a few women among them. And that's how I decided that if Samara wanted to talk to me, I would really want to learn her story and follow her life for a bit, because most of the other gun owners and journalists and ATF agents and just a lot of people in this research, they were men. Finding a woman was super interesting for me.
The way that you portray her, so I'm just going to warn you that may not be a question. This may just be a compliment or a comment, as we say at academic conferences. But, at one point, Samara actually describes herself as a monster. And yet you managed to provide this just really sobering account of her as a complex whole person. So, she's wounded and she's violent. She's ruthless. She's vulnerable. And, we can't see her violence as justified. But we also totally can't completely say that at least some of it isn't wholly unjustified, especially when she takes out her anger against fellow Zetas. You do a really great job of putting the reader in this almost ambivalent stance vis-a-vis her. And I think one of the things that I find often frustrating, or it's like a wall we often hit when we're talking about gun violence or any kind of criminal behavior. For example, the war on drugs. We have a harder time talking about the war on guns. We like to talk about, the people who are persecuted for mere possession, but, looking at people who have lived lives of violence and extending compassion to them, that's a much harder task. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for doing such an incredible job of presenting her story to us and really seeing all of your informants as full human beings. And so I guess I'm curious, you could take this in either direction. I am curious how you think about the writing process in that regard, but also, what your takeaway is in terms of how we need to be thinking about violence and people who become ensnared in violence differently to move forward in terms of our public conversations and our debates.
I knew very early on in this research that I don't want to focus on victims of gun violence or survivors of gun violence. I wanted to talk to people and hang out with people, do my field work with people who actually were gun users. So they are the ones that smuggled guns and used guns. And then that's the reality of it, that a lot of these, you can call them perpetrators of violence, a lot of them were victims of violence first. So these categories of who is good or bad, or who is a victim and who is a perpetrator, kind of get blurry. And telling these stories, the reason I decided to focus on just a few individuals rather than write a more standard ethnography where I generalized more, I wanted to zoom into their lives so that people would be able to understand these nuances, that one can be both. One can be a violent person, but also one can be suffering from that violence. And it's very, very intertwined. So that had to do with the writing choices as well. And the other part of, I think, I reflect about that maybe in the end of the book too. It was difficult to find the right language to write about violence and about guns because, well, for guns, that's, one kind of situation, because I needed to learn how to talk about them in a natural way, because in the beginning I didn't even know how to call different gun parts. When it comes to violence, I didn't want to over-sensationalize it, like see often in the media, but I also didn't want to just use this dry academic language. But how do you make people want to read a book about gun trafficking and gun violence that is not assigned to them in the classroom, or they are not reading it for research, but just go to a bookstore and pick up this book? how do you create that kind of narrative? So it was writing and rewriting. And I think there are still some a little clunky parts, but I'm glad to hear that the narrative is strong in parts.
Yeah. Well, and I do think people are hungry for nuance. And I don't know if this may be, I think it's a compliment. I don't know. Maybe not. Some people have different reactions and you're like, oh, it reminds me of this movie. But the level of nuance and complexity actually, like, have you seen the new Mad Max movie?
No, not yet.
The prequel. Well, I feel like Furiosa and Samara, I'm like the narrative nuance and all of that very comparable. So I don't know if that's a compliment or not. But another example actually of a movie, another example of a movie that I thought of when I was reading this, or maybe I saw the movie after, I can't remember, but they're really of a piece, is actually the movie Civil War. And so this is the movie that is basically, it's the final crescendo of Civil War in the U.S. Texas and California have joined forces. So of course, everybody who's watching the movie is like, this can't be real. Okay, well, it's a movie, so get over it. But what I thought was really interesting in terms of the parallel between your book and Civil War is that both of these are stories of really, incomprehensible violence, right? And so how do you approach that? In Civil War, the lens is through journalists. And so you also use journalists, I think, in a very similar way, where you tell the story of violence through the way that the storytellers tell the story, which is journalists in your book. And whether it's reading their stories or traveling with them as they are trying to parse out what's going on, you are, in doing so, sort of offering something subtly different than a journalist account, of course. And so what does it mean to tell a story, particularly a story of violence, through the lens of the storytellers, that is, the journalists?
I understand how some scholars might be offended if their work is compared to, popular movies. I'm glad you chose Civil War and not Narcos. There is some truth, like, why are these films popular, right? They might not represent the reality the way we want to in terms of accuracy, but the story is so powerful that it stays with people and it changes how people think. So I do take it as a compliment. And I think working with a journalist, yes, part of it was logistics, like going to certain areas of the country where it was very dangerous to go alone. But a big part of it was asking questions about how we construct this narrative about violence and seeing whether there are like parallels between how anthropologists or how social scientists approach this and how journalists approach it, how our goals and our lens is somewhat similar, but then maybe it departs.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that you, I think, accomplish by bringing the reader along on these trips with journalists, you kind of allow the reader to inhabit this middle ground that I think is really hard to get to. It's kind of extreme, right? It's either an over-identification with the heroes of the story, the wielders of violence, or it's the kind of this sense of, violence is out of sight, out of mind. It happens over there to other people in other places. I don't have to think about it. I'm thinking about the pieces in the book where you're going to abandoned spaces where we know violence has happened. We have to sit with it. We're looking at it, through your lens, obviously. We're just able to sit in that space. And I think that is a space that, quite frankly, that's been evacuated in the U.S. in the context of the U.S. gun debate. It's very, very hard to get people to just sit in that space without jumping to one political position or, be-all, end-all analysis or whatever. So I just think it's so powerful. Of course, as you're doing that, you get the reader in touch, I think, with the danger that you brushed up against over the course of field work. I'm wondering how you managed to remain safe, how you took care of yourself. And obviously, you talk about some of the safety precautions that you took over the course of writing the book. But I'm really curious about sort of not just your physical safety, but your mental well-being, your stamina. You did this work over the course of many years. How did you keep yourself going in this project?
Going into this, I knew it would be hard, but I knew the more obvious forms of danger, the kind of physical danger that you mentioned, so I knew how to prepare. But the mental aspect of it was perhaps even more significant and more long-lasting, because every time in the field I had to question myself how much I can do and where to draw that kind of boundary or limit. Is it okay to go to that interview at 6 p.m.? What about 9 p.m.? Is it okay to go to that town? Should I go there alone? And kind of asking those questions and doubting myself and questioning myself every day. Even that was just difficult for a researcher. And once in a while, like after like keeping your guard up, knowing kind of both weighing what to do and not to do, and every time meeting with a person, like having ways to go back to the hotel and having these backup plans. And I had to take breaks more, like every few weeks I had to leave the field. I would come back to the United States just to have a few nights of kind of rest and then go back in. The pandemic happened towards the end of this field work. On the one hand, it wasn't a good period for a lot of us, and it was difficult on many fronts for me as well. But at the same time, it gave me kind of space to rest before I go back to the field again and finish this project. Writing was therapeutic. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Often we talk about writing as making us need therapy. So that's good. That's great. Thank you for all of that. And thank you for, just sharing your vulnerability as you move through this field work. This also seems like a good time to talk about your piece in the Boston Globe, where you write about your decision to buy a gun, which is also linked up with this project. And so could you tell us why you did buy a gun and why you thought it was important to write about this for a public audience, actually just in advance of your book's publication?
Writing about this was the only way I could process what happened and could understand why I bought the gun and what role it does in my life. The reason I got it was multiple. Well, during this research, there were a few moments when I thought I wanted to buy a gun, and I was very close. I passed, like in the part of the country where I have been living, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, it's not like you can go into the store and buy a gun. You need to pass a gun safety course, or in Rhode Island, you need to pass this test, and then there is a waiting period and things like that. It took me a while, and eventually I got it. By then, I already knew the materiality of the gun, and I had fired guns during the course of my research. So it wasn't so much that, but I wanted to see what it means to live with a gun in your house, and how would it change me, if at all, what kind of relationship I can have as quite newly minted U.S. citizen. So this is my country now, and I'm trying to wrap my mind around what it means to be a citizen of the United States and what is my relationship to guns and gun culture. So part curiosity for research, but maybe even more kind of personal need to understand my personal relationship to it. And then writing about it for the public, I wrote about it for myself. Actually, the very interesting thing is that I started writing the very day I bought the gun. I took it home, and the first thing I could do after I locked it in the safe is start writing about this experience, not with any intent to publish it anywhere, but because that was the only way for me to think about it. And after a few months of kind of having this relationship and having a gun in the drawer, in the safe, I thought that maybe it is time for me to write a public piece. And the part of it was also, as you mentioned, like we are so polarized in this country, right? We are either pro-guns or we are anti-guns. And I thought that writing that I have a gun and I have a complicated, uncertain relationship with a gun would give me a voice as well to talk about guns that is not from one of these camps.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask the question then of like, if you have this new voice, who's listening? And it's interesting because we've had, this conversation on this podcast about, how people respond to gun owners within the academy. I think it's interesting that I think some people, whether you're a gun owner, and I should also say just people who are studying gun ownership. And I feel like scholars, it seems like there's two experiences that scholars have, but maybe you'll bring up a third, is the scholars who study this and do this kind of work where people kind of are like, why would you want to study that? What are you doing? They're kind of low grade, like, what's going on? They feel a bit marginalized by their choice of research topic. And then I feel like, and this has actually been my experience, where by doing this work, I actually get people telling me about like, oh, I almost bought a gun, or I grew up with guns. And I'm like, oh, not expected this from, my academic colleagues. And I'm curious, like, what has been the response from your colleagues at Brown, but also just more generally, what kind of response you got to that piece?
I was quite concerned about the response. I thought I might lose friends and colleagues and students and who knows what. But Boston Globe is behind paywall, so maybe not that many people read it. No, I'm joking. The response has been somewhat similar. So I think people who are upset or concerned, they are not the ones that are talking to me or telling me those things. The ones that I've heard from were telling me, oh, I grew up around guns. We had one when I was little. My parents had one. Actually, nobody told me they currently have a gun. The more distressing part was how I can still count on one hand, but that's more than I would want to, of my colleagues lost someone to firearm suicide.
So let's move into the politics of this all and what impact you hope that your book could have on the political conversation in the U.S. Those supporting the criminalization of immigration into the U.S. are often the same people who are supporting the deregulation of firearms. We know this from just listening to the political discourse. We also know this from work from sociologists like Fidan El-Siglu, Renee Flores, and others. And I think sometimes this is often analyzed as sort of this like package deal, that these agendas kind of all mutually reinforce each other as part of the conservative agenda, whether it's through racism, the politics of fear, xenophobia. But your book actually reveals that the relationship between, I'll just say, conservative gun rights politics and anti-immigration politics is far more than just an overarching political vibe. They are actively fueling one another through flows of guns and flows of people. Can you explain this connection for us?
So let's take Texas as an example, which has very anti-immigrant politics at the moment and building the walls and putting buoys on the river and kind of enacting all kinds of state laws against migrants. It is also the state that is the primary source of most guns recovered in crime scenes in Mexico. So 43% of all guns recovered in Mexican crime scenes between 2017 and 2021 came from Texas alone. This is kind of a reinforcing circle. The less regulated gun sales are, the easier it is for straw purchasers to buy them, the more of them end up in Mexico and Central America and Haiti, other parts of the world. And then the more people are fleeing those communities, trying to reach the United States to seek for asylum, the more we are seeing this border crisis and uncontrolled border on TV. We see people who are running away from these guns that are made so easily available. So this type of political thinking, it's like digging the hole deeper and deeper without actually finding a way out. This is like the vicious circle of violence.
Yeah. And now the Mexican government is actually suing gun manufacturers in the U.S. And this was initially dismissed in 2022. It got appealed, and now it's been given the green light to proceed, and it's a $10 billion lawsuit. So I know some of this happened, I think, not after your book came out, but after you probably missed your last chance to revise the book and add any of the new developments in. But can you explain this legal strategy? So, like, what is the Mexican government hoping to achieve, and also how this is legal? So what standing does the Mexican government have to sue U.S. companies, U.S. gun manufacturers?
On the one hand, I'm really glad this lawsuit didn't end before or while I was writing the book, because usually they take a long time, and this one will continue a long time because, yes, it was dismissed and appealed and now proceeding, but then the gun companies are now asking the Supreme Court to intervene. So who knows what will happen with this lawsuit. I am not a lawyer, so I cannot go into the nitty-gritty, but basically they are saying, the Mexican government is saying that they are not party, well, the PLACA, or the Protection of Legal Commerce in Arms Act, does not apply to the Mexican government. This law, I don't know whether you talked in other episodes about it, but it prevents people in the US from suing gun companies because of injuries or deaths that their guns cause. So Mexican government is saying that they never agreed. This is not like this social contract is for people in the United States that we approved through our elected representatives. Mexico had nothing to do with that, and that this principle should not apply to them. So, and if there is a chain of causation that the companies are selling guns to distributors who have a bad track record of selling guns to straw buyers who then take them to these crime scenes. And if we looked at the evidence if we go into the stage of discovery, we will know whether these companies are actually aware that a lot of their guns end up in Mexico. There is part of the lawsuit that accuses these companies also of marketing their guns or making the types of models that are particularly appealing to organized crime groups in Mexico. So it's a multi-pronged lawsuit. It's a very ambitious one, but similar to the ones that were against the big tobacco or big pharma on behalf of the victims.
So sadly, we are running out of time, which means that I just have a couple of wrap-up questions for you. If there is any agenda that this podcast has, it's to build out the community of gun scholars. This is your first book on guns, gun violence proper. I'm curious, do you consider yourself a gun scholar? What does that term mean to you?
I am not as good as a gun scholar as you are or others. Like, this is my very kind of first dipping my toes into this. But I do hope that this book engages in conversation with, especially with gun scholarship that is so much focused on the United States for very important reasons. I think we can broaden this conversation because both for comparative purposes, but also to see that the effects of U.S. guns reach behind the borders.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what's so phenomenal about your book is that even the scholarship that looks at, sort of global guns and what's going on with, you're obviously rooting this in the flow of guns across the border, but you're also showing how culture and politics and all of these things push back and forth. And you basically you can't read this book and not think, wow, I have to completely rethink sort of the categories of analysis that I come to this topic with. It's really, really powerful. So absolutely agree that we need to be thinking beyond the U.S. in many, many different ways in terms of thinking about guns in society. And that kind of maybe answers my next question, but I'm going to ask you it again anyway, which is what's the question that, having done this research, we need to be asking about guns in society, but we're not?
Yeah, I think you did quite answer that question. For anthropologists, the most important thing is to kind of question, not take anything for granted. So I think we need to look at other countries and see what their relationship to guns in order to question what is happening in the United States. That comparative perspective as well as a more global perspective is something that is important.
Okay, so last question. We're going to read your book if we haven't already, but what are you reading now? What would you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, well, it's summer. I don't know when you'll broadcast this, but we're talking in June and the semester is over. So I am done with my nonfiction reading and I am reading fiction. I'm reading Morgan Talty's new novel, Fire Exit, which is amazing. I highly recommend. Loved his first book and have plenty of other fiction books for my summer list.
Excellent. Well, you deserve an awesome, restful break this summer. I hope you get it. Thank you so much for enlightening us with this conversation and with your incredible book. Thank you, Ieva.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenny. This was wonderful. Your questions are fantastic, and thank you for so carefully reading the book.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.